Today we're going to do an introduction to John Donne's poetry, and his poems fit into the brand of metaphysical poetry, which simply means that it's beyond the physical. So John Donne was writing in a time where, you know, they were pursuing the unanswerable questions. Questions such as, you know, what actually happens after death. Now, John Donne was British, and he preceded Shakespeare by probably half a century, and you know, it was a very Christian society, and part of Christian doctrine was this idea of sin and salvation, and then eternal life, and the idea of living in heaven once one died. And so John Donne's really preoccupied with that in his sonnets. It was also the Renaissance era, and this was a really revolutionary period in history because it was challenging all the knowledge and the long-held ideas that predominantly had been controlled by the church. You know, with the invention of the printing press, it sort of broke down this idea that the church could control all knowledge. And so it was a really radical time where science, for example, was changing the way people thought about things. It was also the age of discovery, so Europeans in particular were hopping in boats and travelling around the world and discovering new worlds, new cultures, and you know, they were mapping the world. So it was a time of a really radical expansion of ideas, which brings us to the content of John Donne's poetry. So John Donne, well, there are two types of poems that Donne studies: sonnets and love poems, and his are called holy sonnets, as he, you know, that was the preoccupation of his work. And he wrote Petrarchan sonnets. And Petrarchan sonnets are a type of brand of sonnet, I suppose. So it followed the same sonnet form of having 14 lines, but it just had a slight difference to a traditional sonnet. So in his sonnet, what we see is an octave. So the first 8 lines is called the octave, and then the last 6 lines is called the sestet. But within the sestet, the last 2 lines are called the couplet. Some of them rhyme and some of them don't. Okay, but in that last 2 lines in the couplet, the ultimate statement of the poem is made. Now, one thing that we need to understand about, one of the key terms, is this term wit. So in John Donne's era, wit simply really was another term for intellect. And Donne's poetry and many of his contemporaries were preoccupied with these intellectual puzzles. So we find that in the beginning of the poem that there's a puzzle that's put forward, and then he will work through the poem to solve that. The other term that we need to know is this term conceit. And a conceit is a comparison of two unlikely things or objects, and it's presented in a form of a puzzle, I suppose, and what the poet will do is try and make them actually mesh together and seem to fit. So in Death Be Not Proud, for example, the conceit is that death is a living being, which, you know, is sort of paradoxical. And the other one we could talk about would be This Is My Play's Last Scene. So life is compared to a play, and then throughout the poem they work that out. So if we head back over here, what we have in the holy sonnets is we see that the poem begins with a conceit, presenting an intellectual sort of puzzle, and then it will work their way through to moving away from the intellect and having a more emotional response to the topic. And it's through the movement to emotion that the greatest statement is able to be made. So essentially what's occurring is that the poem begins with the head. You know, it's preoccupied with intelligence and trying to solve things in an abstract manner. And then there's a giving over to the heart, and you have a more humane and emotional response to that. And there's a clear distinction between the two parts of the poem. And the other term that we need to know is this idea of a volta. And a volta is generally the first word of the sestet, and it'll be a then or a but, generally. And what it does is it presents a bit of a pause, I suppose, and it's an indicator of a shift in tone. So quite often in the beginning of the poem, Donne is really either aggressive or he's a bit arrogant in his tone, or he'll be very melodramatic. And generally, what he's doing through his, presenting quite an aggressive tone, is he's masking his own insecurities about the topic that he's presenting. Quite often, it's this idea of sin, and he feeling that he hasn't absolved himself of sin to the point where he'll be able to live eternally with God. So, so we move from wit, and we find that there'll be a word, but or then, or something like that, which will create a bit of a pause, I suppose, and then a shift in tone. So we move from a melodramatic and arrogant tone to a much more submissive and humble tone here. Quite often he's talking to God, so he'll directly address God and challenge the thinkings of, or the preachings of God, or the ideas, and then in the sestet he will submit to the glory of God's statement and his omnipotence, and he, in submitting, he finds a sense of calm, and that restores order. Yeah, so that's pretty much it in a short moment. We'll look at love poems later. They use a lot of the same sort of devices, but it doesn't follow the really highly specialised metre and structure of this. These were written in iambic pentameter. They're precise. It is a real testament to his brilliance.